Morning. Good morning. Good morning, people of LinkedIn. Good morning. We are live. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. It's Friday. If you are joining me live, please say good morning in the chat. If you're watching on the replay, thank you for taking some time out of your day to check out this topic, the future of D&I, data-driven solutions. Now, if you're joining me live, please say good morning. Say good morning in the chat. You will notice, so some of you will be like, where's Mac? Where's Mac Alonge? Mac has the flu. Mac has the flu. So Mac messaged me a couple of days ago. And I'm not sure I like this term. I think it might be a little bit sexist, but Mac messaged me a couple of days ago to say, Cheryl, I've got man flu. So Mac has man flu. So Mac is not joining because Mac is unwell, unfortunately. Mac has the flu. So you've just got me. And obviously, I mean, I'm not as much of a data expert as Mac, right? But I am an accountant. So I do know a few things about data. And obviously I've been working in this D&I space for quite a while. And so I do know about, a lot of the challenges of data. So I'm going to take you through, some of my learnings and some of the things that I know in terms of what works from a data perspective. Let's see if I can get my lighting correct because I can see reflections. It's so dark this morning still, right? So data-driven solutions. So part of the reason that I wanted to start off this series with this topic, so we are doing a series. So if you've seen the post for this, you'll have realized the future of D&I, right? There is a lot of conversation about where is D&I going, the backlash in terms of D&I. There's a lot of stuff happening in the States. So if you've been watching the comings and goings since the election and some of the announcements from certain organizations like Walmart, for example, I think was the most recent one. There is a lot of conversation about what is happening with D&I. Does it even have a future? A lot of people are asking. So I've got a series coming up, of which this is the first session, talking about, what do we need to do in terms of getting D&I to a place where it adds value to the business and it can get back on track, right? So I've got a couple of amazing guests coming up. Obviously, Mac should have been the first guest today, but Mac is unwell. So I've got some guests coming up in January. I think I detailed them in the post, talking about different aspects in terms of the future of D&I. So on the 3rd of January, I'm going to be joined by the amazing Lisa Ardley-Price, who is General Counsel at NatWest. And she's going to be talking about harnessing the power of ERGs and the place that ERGs and employee networks hold in terms of the future of D&I. I'm then going to be talking with Joanne Conway, who is an amazing DI leader here in the UK, in fact, has a global role in terms of D&I. And I'm going to be talking with her about the importance of social mobility when it comes to DE&I. I'm also going to be talking to Zubeda, Limbada and Savannah Hanson from I can't remember the name of the organizations, but we're going to be talking about Gen Z in the workplace. And what is it that Gen Z are looking for in terms of inclusion and like having a sense of belonging in the workplace? And I'm also going to be talking to one of my former colleagues, Helen Hay from the amazing Shakespeare Martineau. And we're going to be talking about actually how do you embed DEI into BAU? So how does it just become business as normal? And I can see I've missed one out. How could I? I've missed out Dr. Poornima Luthra, who is going to be joining me. Those of you that know Poornima from here on. Connect Futures, sorry. Sorry, that was Zubeda. I'm guessing that's you. Apologies. I can't quite see who the LinkedIn username. Zubeda, Limbada, and Savannah from Connect Futures, of course, from Connect Futures. And I've also got, I was just saying, Dr. Poornima Luthra. Some of you might know her from LinkedIn. And I'm going to be talking to her. She's been doing an experiment where she's been listening to, she's been kind of being out of the echo chamber and listening to a lot of, shall we say, slightly right wing and some quite far right actually material, almost as part of an experiment around listening to, the backlash in terms of D&I. So we're going to have an amazing session talking about unpacking the backlash. What is driving the backlash when it comes to D&I? Okay, so good morning. We're going to kick things off. I'm going to try to keep things really tight today because I'm on a crazy schedule. So we're going to start off with data-driven solutions. And why did I want to start here? Well, not just because I've been trying to get Mac Alonge on this LinkedIn Live for the longest time ever, and clearly I've failed again this morning. But for those of you that may have read, there was a government report here in the UK that was done, I want to say in July, maybe of 2024, called Inclusion in the Workplace. And one of the things they talked about, I mean, a lot of what they talked about was actually just common sense in terms of good D&I. So it wasn't groundbreaking. It wasn't overly political, but there were some really good takeaways from it. And one of the very good takeaways actually was that when we do this work, you know, the work of inclusion, belonging, etc., it should be evidence-based, right? It sounds obvious. It sounds like common sense. It should be data-driven. And so that's one of the things that I want to talk about this morning, you know, making sure that when we do this work, it is data-driven. It's not only based on gut feel or what other people are doing or the flavor of the month, you know, in terms of, you know, whatever community, etc., is being supported. We're actually looking at data and driving solutions. So if you're watching this morning and this is something that you've wrestled with and you've got any specific questions around data or the challenges of getting data, please do drop them in the comments. Or if you've had any successes actually in terms of things that you've measured that have really sort of like changed the dial, then again, please drop those in the comments. But what I'm going to be talking through is obviously always starting with why. So understanding why you're wanting the data and what data you're trying to gather, identifying any constraints. So actually, what are the constraints to gathering data for you as an organization? Because it's not the same for everybody, right? So I'm going to talk about what that looks like. And then I'm going to go into three, I guess, almost like levels of data, right? So I'm going to start at the base level in terms of almost like where would we expect kind of everyone to be, right? So where would you start? If you're starting from scratch in terms of inclusion and belonging and culture and you're wanting to make change, where would you start? So we're going to start with foundations. And then I'm going to talk about leveling up in terms of if you're maybe a little bit further along in the journey, what kind of data could you be thinking about using? And then finally, for those that are the data ninjas, right, or the evidence gathering ninjas, I'm going to talk about some of the more advanced elements of data and or evidence that you can use as well. So that is what we are going to be talking about. So starting with the why, and you know, I often start here when it comes to inclusion and belonging, being really clear on the why, just because I think, you know, and I have so many questions with clients where I often see a lot of activity with that's misdirected or doesn't really have a purpose in terms of what it's doing. And there's this phrase that's not the most complimentary, but there's a phrase called busy fools. And sometimes there is a danger, especially around this work, because actually in terms of this work, there is a lot of passion and there is a lot of energy for wanting to do the right thing. But sometimes when we're not clear about the why, we suddenly start to create a lot of activity without being really clear in terms of what we're solving. So I think starting with the why, even in terms of the data, what are we trying to measure and why? What are some of the problems that we're seeing? I mean, obviously data can help to identify and really clarify what the problems are. So you might be starting with we think there is an issue in X. We think there is an issue with a lack of representation at senior levels, or we think there is an issue with discontentment within certain communities. So that could be where you're starting. You're starting with, this is what we think the problem is. And so this is the data that we're going to collect to try to tackle it. One of the things I mentioned here is confirmation bias. So obviously being aware of confirmation bias even before you set out. So, you know, you're typically with data trying to either prove or disprove something. So just beware of being too fixed to, you know, a hypothesis that you form, because that often then shapes the data. And then surprise, surprise, sometimes the data then comes out confirming what you think. But actually, And I have a really good friend who always says to me, we should always be looking for data that disproves what we think, right? Look for data that disproves what we originally think. So that's something to think about. So when you're even designing or thinking about the data that you want to collect, think about collecting data that disproves your views, right? Is there any previous analysis? And one of the places that I always start is, lots of organizations come to me and they say, oh, we're thinking of doing like an inclusion survey, and great if you want to do that. And there are some fantastic organizations. So obviously, Mac Alonge and the Equal Group, you can go to organizations that specialize in really delving into this, one or two other organizations as well. But often a lot of organizations have already got data from things like your annual employee survey, or other types of data that you can actually start with. You may already have some good HR data. If you're an organization of a certain size, you probably already have some monitoring data as well. So you're not always starting from scratch. So you can start with what you have already. And obviously, and that can give you insight into the why. And then finally, as well, thinking about the DEI, the business strategy. What role does DEI play in this organization? Is it that we are an organization where we value innovation and creativity, and so therefore we're actually looking to make sure that we have workplaces that are very diverse in terms of background, and organizations where conflict is really valued, right? So I've gone into organizations where they haven't necessarily been looking for data around, different demographics. They've been looking for data around how good are we at generating healthy conflict, right? Are people comfortable to just say what they really think? So for them as an organization, they were a marketing agency. So for them, that was really important. They were very small. They were like, we can kind of see the demographics around us. We're a very small team, but we want to know, are we good at generating healthy conflict and managing that? So that's what they wanted to design their data around. So thinking about the business strategy and what's important to the organization before you even design what you're trying to find or validate through your data. Identifying constraints. So I've talked already about really small organizations. For anybody that's in the UK, and I think this kind of number is, or similar to this number, is used in other locations as well, but we know that, if you're in the hundreds, so if your organization is in the hundreds or smaller, and we use this typical cutoff of 250 as being quite small. So in the UK, that means that you don't have to submit lots of like regulatory and sort of monitoring data around stats, etc. Size of organization can be a real constraint when it comes to data, particularly demographic data. It can be a constraint if you're very, very small. But also there's something about anonymity, and this is where you've got to be really careful, because I've seen with very, very small organizations, if you start to gather data around what people think of the organization, and you're really, really small, and you start to want to cut it by demographics. So for example, what do women think, or what do people with disabilities think, or people who are LGBTQ plus, or people who are black and brown, what do they think? And the organization is too small. You can sometimes have a situation where people can identify who has said what, and that is a problem. So unless everybody's going into it eyes wide open, and they know that there is a risk that that you won't be able to keep comments, for example, or perspectives anonymous, then you just have to be really careful in the design of that survey. And this is something where the experts in survey can help you with this. I remember years and years and years and years ago helping to design employee surveys. So that's why I've got a little bit of knowledge in this space. They say a little bit of knowledge is a dangerous thing, but yeah, many years ago I was helping to design the employee survey as part of like some cultural change work in an organization that I was in. So that's why I know some of these things around being really careful about size of data sets, for example, because when it comes to anonymity, that's very important for creating a safe space where people can really give their views, particularly about things like, do I believe that this is a fair organization? So when it comes to inclusion, etc., and some of those questions, size can be a real challenge. global versus local. For anybody that has a role, and I know I've got a meeting with somebody later today who I know has a global D&I role. And one of the challenges when it comes to collecting data, I mean, we haven't got long enough for me to even get into all of the challenges around data when it comes to global. Oh, good morning, Andrea. How are you doing? Oh, you're creating an interview survey for the network. Amazing. So this is absolutely perfect timing for you. And obviously, yeah, so in terms of networks, employee resource groups, this hopefully will be really helpful as well, as well as for D&I professionals and HR professionals. So the global versus local, right? Anybody that has a DEI role or is working with European colleagues when it comes to HR data sets, the challenges. There are some countries, and I'm going to say, let me look at, say, for example, Sweden, just because I had a client that was based in Sweden, big Swedish retailer. We know that in Sweden, or at least certainly a couple of years ago, people weren't even talking about race or even collecting data about race. They would actually talk more about where were people born? So where were people born? Were they born inside Sweden or were they born out of Sweden? Right. So the terminology is even totally different. And even thinking about people through that lens, it just was not a lens, that is used in that country. And then we've got GDPR and all of the constraints around there. And then you talk about countries like Germany, where because of their history, right, we won't go into it because we haven't got enough time, there are real constraints and barriers. And although some of those constraints aren't as tight as people think they are, because when it comes to monitoring and for equality purposes, you can actually measure a lot more than people think you can, even in Europe. But culturally, employees in those countries are not used to being asked questions about, their sexual orientation, their religious beliefs, their ethnicity, etc. So you have to tread so carefully. And I would say if you have got a role, particularly where you're looking after Europe and you're thinking about collecting any demographic data, you probably need to get an external consultant, a comms specialist, to actually help to devise and define a campaign to actually roll that out, because there is a lot of messaging that is needed to collect data in countries that have not been used to submitting this data. Okay, so those are just some of the global versus local challenges before we've even got into the differences in terms of terminology around, for example, things like disability, race and ethnicity, sexual orientation, etc. It's an absolute minefield in terms of global versus local. So definitely get the experts in, either experts in terms of survey best practice or comms experts. Inclusive methods. This sounds really obvious, but for anybody that's creating a survey, what you will know is, particularly if you have colleagues who, we sometimes refer to frontline colleagues. So colleagues, for example, maybe you are in like a retail organization and you have colleagues that work in stores, or they're on a shop floor, or you're in manufacturing and people maybe work in factories. So typically, front line, where they're not sat at a desk all day. So often we have a lot of colleagues that don't have emails, right? So they don't have emails. They may not even have, access to like the intranet pages. You've really got to think about the design of the survey and how you're actually going to collect the data, right? That's a real challenge, depending on where staff are. And obviously then there's things like accessibility and all of those challenges as well. Some other constraints that you might have, targets versus quotas. Again, I feel like I've done a LinkedIn Live on this before. I'll have to remember to include some of the links. I think I did a LinkedIn Live about setting D&I strategy, and I think I talked about targets and quotas in there. We all know, certainly for the UK and for the US in particular, quotas illegal, rather unlawful, right? You cannot set a quota that sort of says, we will have a minimum of 30% women. You can't do that, right, as a quota. Quotas we don't tend to do in this country, in the UK, and also in the US. You can certainly have targets. You can have aspirational targets around diversity, but really tread with caution, especially given the current climate, in terms of the current DI backlash climate. Tread with caution. take legal advice, right, would be my advice here. There have been some changes in the US recently where there was a case where it was almost like found that it was unlawful to include diversity, or rather DEI targets, in people's performance objectives, right? The performance objectives of senior leaders. So just tread really carefully at the moment. This is a little bit of a minefield. When people are asking me about what would work in terms of targets, I always say start with, if you're looking at, for example, talent acquisition, so you're looking at hiring, where I say you should set targets is look at the top of the funnel in terms of who do we attract? When we put a role out, so when we're hiring, who do we attract? Do we attract the most diverse, pool of applicants that we can, based on the sector that we're in and the locations? You have to kind of like normalize it for. So, for example, if you are an engineering firm, there's no point in having a target that's something, and you're recruiting graduates. There's no point in having a target of 50-50 in terms of gender balance, right? 50% men, 50% women, if you're recruiting, say, for example, in engineering, because we know that in terms of the demographics of students coming out of university, I'm going to say, I think it's something like 25% women coming out with engineering degrees. So, I mean, you could be ambitious and set a 50-50 target for applicants, but, you're already kind of going to be on a bit of a losing streak. So targets are better, but I sort of say start with your target at the top of the funnel. How do we become an organization that attracts the most diverse range of applicants? And then you start to measure that diversity as you go through the funnel and as it goes through the pipeline, to measure for things like bias and things like that. So when it comes to targets, especially if you're starting from scratch, that's where I tend to start. More advanced organizations, so some of the organizations I would call out, because if you go onto their website, you'll probably see some of the things that they are doing, although things may have changed recently, right, with Trump getting in all of that. But KPMG, maybe have a look at their targets on their website. Sky here in the UK as well, have a look at their targets. They have specific targets around representation at all grades of the organization. So that's something that they certainly had done in the past. So that's something that you may want to check out. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the foundations now in terms of the data. Let's get into the types of data that we tend to look at. And for those of you even that are in networks, whether or not you own the data, you don't really tend to own the data, but obviously you want this input into what would be useful for this organization to be measuring as data that we as networks can then have a look at to see whether we're making progress. Okay. So foundations, right? Base level. If you're a large enough organization, so here in the UK, if you have more than 250 employees, you're going to be doing equalities monitoring data anyway, right? There are just minimum, sort of standards that you've got to adhere to based on UK law. And it's similar in other countries if you're beyond a certain size. So you've got that. So we're just really at base level, regulatory, ticking the box, etc. Let's get that done. Right. The next stage may be demographics by grade. So as I say, I know KPMG used to do this because they used to have targets. So demographics by grade is maybe where people go to next, because obviously we know that representation at senior levels contributes to sense of belonging, etc. So starting to measure that, because also we're starting to measure, are there barriers in the organization? Are there what's called, broken rungs or glass ceilings, etc. And can we spot where they are? Where is it happening? Where are people getting blocked, right? So demographics by grade. Levels of engagement. So this can come through. So if you've already got an end of year survey, an employee survey, end of year survey, whatever it be, across the organization, you can already do this in terms of measuring levels of engagement and inclusion and belonging, feelings of inclusion and belonging, cut by demographic, probably without even doing an additional survey. And there are just a few key questions that you need to ask to put into that employee survey. So questions about, feeling as though I can bring myself to work, feeling as though I can bring myself to work and still be promoted, right? Those are two different questions. Feelings of this workplace values fairness. This workplace treats people fairly. poor performance is managed in this organization? Those sorts of questions actually are really good at giving an indicator as to whether people have a sense of belonging in an organization. There are some other questions. It's based on some survey data, which if I get time, I will include in the comments to this. So basically, there are a handful of questions that you can include already in your annual survey. You don't need to necessarily go out and do anything different. Just put a handful of questions in, put a little bit more demographic data, make sure that you've got the the guardrails in around anonymity, because that will be a challenge and that will potentially constrain the responses, and then you're good to go in terms of those foundations. In terms of leveling up, so once you've got like those are almost like the basics, those are like the baby steps, right? That's where we start. In terms of then leveling up, so for those that are already, you got that down pat, you can do that. Where do people tend to go next? So what you can do, and remember this links back to the why, what you're trying to get out of the data. You can then deep dive, and I've seen this done really well, again, whether it be around your employee surveys or specific surveys around inclusion, diversity, fairness, whatever you're delving into, having focus groups is really useful. And you can either use somebody internal to facilitate that, your DI lead, maybe not a HR lead, but you can use a DI lead, or if you have skilled facilitators, even if they sit in teams like IT, you sometimes have good facilitators in there. Your business analysts are sometimes very good at this type of activity, or you can get an external facilitator in to facilitate some focus groups and listening sessions to really get under the skin of what's happening. Just be careful when you're doing those that they're really well facilitated, and that you're not just taking like the anecdotes from a couple of people and then building a whole strategy around it, right? Because then you've almost like moved away from it being data driven. So when you have focus groups, you still have to have a way of like calibrating that data and making sure that it's, a good blend of objectivity with those kind of like subjective views, right? The next sort of data set that I want to talk about, hiring and attrition. I talked a little bit about the talent acquisition and the pipeline. Employee turnover and retention by demographic is a really, really good indicator. And some organizations do this really well, some not so well. This is an area, again, where you can use an external organization to come in and help with this. So, in which demographics have we got a revolving door? Because what we know some organizations do is they run to do diversity and they start hiring lots of people that are different to the people that already work there. But then people don't stay, right? People leave really quickly and they just have this revolving door. So actually, how do you measure, what that retention looks like by demographics, that you can start to identify where you've potentially got some issues? So that is a really key one that hopefully isn't too difficult to measure hiring and attrition. And then we're getting into some trickier ones now, pipeline and promotion. Measuring that, who is being promoted, what does the pipeline look like, where are people getting stuck, is really important. I had a really worrying conversation with somebody this week, and the organization shall remain nameless, but she said to me, right, it's coming up to end of year appraisal, and my manager said to me, so they got to the meeting to discuss, end of year appraisal. And then my manager said to me, oh, I've already submitted your rating. And she's quite a senior individual. The manager said, I've already submitted all of the team's rating. It's a relatively small team, less than 10 people. I've already submitted them. And didn't even tell her what the rating was. And I was like, okay, so you need to go back, have that conversation. Because for all you know, and I think I'm right in saying she's one female of an entirely male team. And I was like, how do you know that, somebody else hasn't been, everybody else hasn't been rated a certain way and you've been rated a different way, right? So data and analytics around ratings, and also looking at how that process is done. So data around how robust and how objective those processes are. So things like calibration processes, the 9-box matrix process, which I've gone into in a previous video. There's not really time to do it today, but I will leave a link. But data and evidence about the rigor of those processes is really useful, because then, and we're talking obviously about data-driven solutions, you can then think about the sorts of things that you can implement to tackle that. So as an example, Inclusion monitors is something I've heard of, right? So when you're having meetings, or when HR are having meetings about with line managers about who is ready for the next promotion, you have somebody in those meetings that literally is kind of asking those difficult questions in terms of, well, where is the evidence that suggests that that person is ready for a promotion, or where is the evidence that suggests that person is not ready, right? And this could be on the back of, you've had data that says that there is an issue with those processes. Okay, so pipeline and promotion, it's not easy to do, but it's very, very important, and can lead to some very targeted initiatives. And then policy. So what some people will see, sometimes there are organizations, so for example, I know that Mac's organization, the Equal Group, do this in terms of policy audits. So auditing the policies to see, are they inclusive, or actually do those policies need some work, is something that a lot of organizations do. But I know Mac and the Equal Group do that as well in terms of looking at policies. And then getting to some of the more advanced areas of data. So if you've kind of got all of you've done all of that other stuff, you're kind of like at the next level, equal pay audits, right? And now that's a small phrase, but it can mean a lot of things. When I say an equal pay audit, I don't just mean like the headline stats that get reported, for example, into the government in terms of what is our headline gender pay gap. I mean a pay audit where you get an experienced firm or a specialist individual in around pay audits. And what they're doing is they're looking at things like out of cycle pay increases, discretionary bonuses, the frequency of those things is really critical, because actually it's those small micro decisions that add up to a pay gap at the end of the year, right? So the pay gap reporting is the headline stuff, often that needs to be reported anyway for large organizations. But actually the measurement of some of those very tiny micro decisions, those are the sorts of things that you want to get a specialist to come in to look at. And obviously it kind of links to a bit like some of the promotion processes, and looking at the rigor of those processes. Something like a pay audit will potentially come out with some, incredible recommendations about what can be done to kind of like tighten up those processes to make sure that everything is more fair. So that's a really good example of a very evidence-based, data-driven, kind of like way of looking at this particular area, rather than just the headline and, oh, we think we've got a problem, but we don't know what to do. Performance evaluations linked into that story that I just gave you, how do you get into analyzing the performance evaluations, right? Analyzing who's been graded what and why, and what was the evidence, right? So, again, getting specialists to come in and really crawl all over those processes. I mean, we're really talking about like the advanced of the advanced now. Psychological safety as an area, we know is something that can be harder for communities that feel that they're in the minority and don't see themselves represented. So we're getting really here, and this is where you could and should be talking to your EAP, your provider of your employee assistance program, around what it is and how they can support you to look at things like psychological safety, well-being, etc. We're kind of like delving into other areas, and these may be going into, if you're seeing that there are some issues in these areas, you start to develop some surveys and start to collect data around people's well-being, how people are feeling. And finally, because I've gone over and I'm late already for my next meeting, external benchmarking, right? External benchmarking. If you're working with external survey companies, 100% they should be able to do this for you. If they can't, you're probably working with the wrong organization. But if you are asking questions that other organizations have asked, I guarantee they will be able to provide external benchmarking for you. Obviously, you can also do internal benchmarking by location, by region, by team, if the teams are big enough and if you're comfortable that the data set is robust enough. I remember when I worked many, many years ago for the CEO, and we could tell that there was a problem with people thinking that the results wouldn't be anonymous, or that the responses wouldn't be anonymous, because I think in the CEO's office at the time there were probably a maximum of about 20 people working in the CEO's office, and when the survey came back, I think about 300 people said they worked for the CEO in the CEO's office. So clearly, you just have to be careful when you're slicing and dicing data to do like internal comparisons, that the data is robust before you start to kind of like jump to conclusions in terms of benchmarking. And that is it. We're out of time. We're out of time. Mac, if you're watching this back on the replay, please don't heckle me in the comments. So I'm going to try my best next year to get Mac Alonge on here to kind of add on to this, everything that he kind of brings with his wisdom and expertise around data. But I hope that that was useful for you, especially if you're kind of like starting from ground zero and you're not sure where to go. If there was anything I left out, because I'm conscious I was going at about 3,000 miles an hour, please do either drop me a DM or put a question in the comments. I will be in the comments later, just dropping in some of those references that I mentioned, but I've got a packed morning. So, apologies if it's not as soon as it usually is. And that's it. I'm going to leave you with that, and hopefully you will have a great weekend. Thank you so much for listening live. Zubeda, Savannah, Andrea, thank you so much. And if you're watching it back on the replay, thank you for taking a little bit of time out of your day. Have an amazing weekend. Take care.